Charlie could smell the stench of poverty from 20 feet away. It was a strong, pungent smell that made him gag, a mixture of stale urine, sweat, and feces, mixed with sand and dust, all boiled up under the unbearable heat of the sun. The 1-hour bus trip to the dig site at Saqqara opened his eyes to the poverty in the world. He had never seen such a contrast before, between the rich and affluent area around the hotel and the shabby suburbs of the city populated with the poor and the homeless. People were living in mud huts and foraging for food in dustbins and on the riverbank. By Western standards, the whole place was a dump. Seeing this made Charlie realize just how well off he really was. On the way out of town, Charlie caught a glimpse of the pyramid complex at Giza, just visible in the distance on the plateau which formed the edge of the Western Desert. The world-famous cluster of buildings had been constructed in the Third Dynasty by the pharaohs Khufu, Khafra, and Menkore. Khufu was the father, Khafra the son, and Menkora the grandson, and Charlie could not fail to see the similarity in the hierarchy of his own family. Following the road in a southerly direction out of Cairo on the floodplain of the River Nile, Charlie was fascinated to see his first real glimpse of rural Egypt. Away from the squalor of the city, the land here was very fertile, and the Egyptian farmers made full use of the area. The road, which had been built by English and French engineers to facilitate travel alongside the Nile, took them through a number of small villages. The local farmers here grew rice and cotton in the well-irrigated fields, and the whole area was a hive of activity. After 3/4 of an hour, the bus turned sharp right onto a smaller road, and, as they reached the edge of the river valley, the vegetation started to thin out as the fields of rice and cotton began to make way for yellow patches of sand, which could be seen between the palm trees. Charlie could now see the pyramid of Zoser looming up ahead of him high up on the desert plateau. Suddenly, the bus came to an abrupt stop. Chatsworth's voice rang out. "We're here, Charlie boy." Before them, surrounded by a low, crumbling wall covered at the base with sand, Zoser's step pyramid loomed, its irregular profile outlined against the intense blue sky. There were signs of previous excavations all around, which appeared to be no longer in progress. Off to one side, in the distance, marched a series of underground stone tombs, which Rosie pointed out as the Serapeum, where the mummified remains of the sacred Apis bulls had been interred. They were worshipped as the embodiments of the god Ptah and later Osiris, she remarked. As they arrived at the base of the huge pyramid, Max had already dismounted and was speaking to some of the already assembled crew, gesturing at certain points around the site. Max turned as he approached. He hadn't spoken a word about the events of the previous evening, and Charlie had decided to leave it that way. "I've taken the liberty of disposing some of the crew around the perimeter of the site to keep watch, Mr. Waterman." Charlie glanced around at the forbidding expanse of sand, free of any visitors except for their own group and the site officials. The profiles of anyone arriving from any direction would stand out clearly against the stark sky. "I suppose it won't hurt, Max, but how likely are we to be attacked out here?" Max's grim expression didn't ease. "Likely isn't a word you use lightly when you've already been exposed to danger, Mr. Waterman." Charlie wandered over to the north side of the pyramid structure where Chatsworth had collected the remaining workers with the help of their guide and translator. He looked up as Rosie arrived. "Ah, good, there you are," said Chatsworth. "I'm just about to work out the precise location for the dig by determining the angle of the sun and where its shadow of the pyramid will shine." Chatsworth settled down for a quick lecture. "If you know the latitude and the declination of the sun, you can calculate the angle of the shadow on any given day, at any given time. What we need to do is work out the noon altitude of the sun for the winter solstice." He chuckled. "That's much faster than waiting until December to see the actual shadow." His voice trailed off as he pondered for a few minutes, then he announced with a triumphant smile, "The angle is approximately 36 degrees. After another few minutes of calculation, Chatsworth pointed at a spot within the enclosure itself, along the north side. "We'll start digging over there," he remarked, adding, "We should be accurate to within 20 feet or so." "I certainly hope your father knows what he's doing, Rosie," Charlie whispered. She smiled. "Oh yes, Charlie. You can trust him. He has lived all his life for a moment like this." The heat at the dig site was almost unbearable. The rays of the midday sun, now at its highest point in the sky, burned relentlessly onto the backs of the workers who toiled there, slowing their progress and forcing them to stop at regular intervals to drink copious amounts of water from the leather containers that Max had cleverly had the foresight to bring along. It had taken 3 full hours just to mark the boundaries of the intended dig area. Now that this task had been completed successfully, the workers had begun to dig it all out, filling and emptying buckets of sand in selected locations. Chatsworth continued to recheck his calculations every few minutes, conferring with the foreman and the translator, who then reassigned the industrious workers as directed. Charlie and Rosie watched all of this for an hour or so until Rosie, bored by simply watching men stoop, dig, straighten, and haul with no short-term result in sight, shook her head. "Come on, Charlie. Let's explore the rest of the complex. They're not going to find the stela anytime soon." Charlie was reluctant at first, but he had to admit that he wasn't likely to miss any excitement for the time being. "All right," he agreed, and tucked her hand in the crook of his arm as they wandered off through the complex into the great court on the south side of the pyramid. "You know, Charlie," Rosie said after they had been walking for a short time, "I'm really in awe of these old buildings. They've lasted here for centuries. And yet by comparison, our own human lives are so fragile." She stopped and stared up at the steps on the pyramid. Just beside them was a small outbuilding, its walls inscribed with hundreds of handwritten inscriptions. It was graffiti that had been left by tourists. "Look at these, Charlie. These markings have been left here by visitors from all periods of history. People like us who came to this place looked around in awe at the wonders here, and then left, never to return." As Charlie looked up at the carvings, he could see Roman and Greek inscriptions, as well as more recent carvings in the English language. "Doesn't this just illustrate my point about the fragility of human life, Charlie? In reality, we are just visiting the earth for a short time. We are born, we live, and then we die. It seems that life can be so pointless at times." Charlie turned to face her, looking deep into her eyes. "Oh, I don't know about that, Rosie. I'd say that life definitely has its good points." She blushed at the warmth of his gaze and lowered her eyelashes coyly, watching him through the protection they offered. Charlie grinned to himself and took her hands in his, giving her his most earnest smile. "I would say meeting a certain gentleman and his enchanting daughter would be among those good points. What do you think, Rosie?" Even though Rosie had deliberately planned to capture his interest, the warmth of Charlie's gaze now seemed to have transferred itself to the back of her neck and the front of her throat, and she freed her hands as quickly as she could without causing him any alarm, reluctant to lose herself any farther in those blue depths just yet. Turning towards the pyramid, she gave him a saucy look and declaimed, in a sly echo of her father's pedantic tone, "The stepped pyramid was built by the pharaoh Zoser in the 27th century BC, and it is thought to be the first pyramid ever built." "Enough about pyramids, Rosie. Tell me more about you," he interposed, changing the subject adroitly. Flattered by his interest, she maintained her poise. "There's really not much to tell, Charlie. I trained as an Egyptologist so that I could help my father research and prove his ideas about calendar reforms." She noted his raised eyebrow and went on hurriedly. "It's not as much of a sacrifice as it sounds. I've always been interested in ancient Egypt and its culture. It's just that..." "Just that what?" he asked gently. suppressing the urge to take her in his arms. The toe of Rosie's boot drew a small circle in the sand. "Oh," she said slowly, "I know it sounds awful, but sometimes it would be nice to have some money. Like you, Charlie. Father spends most of his income on trying to prove and gain support for his theories, so we rarely have much left over. I see people like those old women on the ship with their fancy dresses and jewelry, and I can't help but wonder sometimes what it would be like to be rich, to be able to buy something just because you want to have it." This, he could answer. "Being rich doesn't make you happy," he said shortly. She stared at him. "That's easy for you to say, Charlie, because you have money," she retorted hotly. "That's exactly my point, Rosie. You have to have money to know that it does not necessarily make you happy. The happiest people don't always have the best of everything. They just make the most of everything that comes their way. You've got a loving father. Money can't buy that." He took her shoulders and turned her around so that she could see her father, gesturing and calling out orders to the workers, clearly in his element. "Look at him, Rosie. No money, but he's obviously very happy." Her sigh and dubious look made it clear that she wasn't convinced. Charlie tried again to convince her. "My grandfather was a famous explorer and naturalist, Rosie. He traveled all over South America studying his beloved birds, and he set up a nature reserve back home for them. Yes, the money made that possible, but I can't help thinking that he would have been happy in the jungle with nothing at all. No money, just his birds and his adventures, totally content with himself and his life. I'd like to achieve contentment like that." Stopping, he drew his own pattern in the sand with his foot. "But my father, well, he's another story. He wants me to settle down, work in a tedious, life-sucking office. He's only concerned with money and himself, and he's not interested in my adventures or my happiness. In fact, he doesn't care much about me at all." Despite her own father's eccentricities, Rosie couldn't fathom being estranged from him. "That's a bit harsh, Charlie. You shouldn't be so hard on your father," she suggested. "After all, nobody is perfect. We all have our faults. I can't believe for 1 minute that your father doesn't love you." Gazing affectionately at her own father, who now was starting to look a little unkempt as he galloped round the work area, she added, "Whatever your father may be, he will always be your father, and you've only got one of those." Charlie was silent, thinking. This was a very profound statement. She was right, of course. No matter how far apart he and his father seemed to be so much of the time, he knew in his heart that he loved his father very much. Although, he thought wistfully, it would be so much easier if things were different, if his father were more tolerant or more giving. Reluctant to give the subject any more thought, he noticed that the stark light blue of the sky was starting to soften. He pulled out his pocket watch and realized with surprise that most of the afternoon had passed. Early evening was now approaching. How time flies when you are enjoying yourself, he thought. Reading his mind, Rosie said softly, "We should probably start back, Charlie." He turned and looked at her. The sun, beginning its descent towards the horizon, touched her bright hair with red-gold fingers and turned it to flame, and set small fires dancing in the warm depths of her brown eyes. Tall, curvy, lit from without and within, she looked like some nature or fertility goddess. Rosie was no less immune to the moment. Her skin felt flushed all over, not just where it was touched by the sun's rays. Charlie's hands closed firmly on Rosie's shoulders as he pulled her unresistingly towards him, his eyes and hers locked in equally intense gazes. Cupping one hand behind her head, Charlie leaned down to Rosie's upturned mouth and was about to take his first taste of those incredibly full lips when a great shout of excitement went up from the diggers. Startled back to reality by the sound, the young couple turned instinctively towards the dig site, where they could see Rosie's father running towards them, shouting, "Charlie! We found it! We found the Stella!" Charlie stared down into the deep hole where the marker stone had been discovered. Remarkably, the ancient markings that had been chiseled into the granite surface were still as fresh as the day they had been carved, despite the passage of time. Chatsworth was practically foaming at the mouth with pleasure. He wiped his sweaty brow and neck with his handkerchief and slid down into the hole. "Here, Charlie. Behold, Imhotep's marker stone." There were no few engravings. The stone tablet was covered in markings, many of which looked meaningless to Charlie's untutored eye. However, Rosie moved around the stone slowly, carefully examining it in the fading light, until she stopped. "Here!" she said triumphantly, and lit her small hand lamp so she could decipher the hieroglyphs on the side of the stone, while the others waited breathlessly. She started to read out aloud the message that had lain here undisturbed for centuries. "In the place where Osiris dwells, at Manu by the ancient burial grounds, at Abdu, therein lies the eternal resting place. Use the sacred symbols to gain access to the underworld, but tread wisely, for the penalty for failure is death." "It all makes sense now," she added, pointing at the inscription. "Manu is the mythical mountain on which the sun sets in the west, one of the two mountains that hold up the sky. The other is Baku, where the sun rose in the east." "What does Abdu mean?" Charlie asked. Rosie continued to run her finger along the line of the hieroglyphs, being careful not to actually touch the weathered stone. "Abdu is the burial place of the early pharaohs. The Greeks called it Abydos. It is about 300 miles south of here. The ancient Egyptians believed it to be the seat of Osiris, the god of the underworld. I should have known." Charlie felt an odd chill on the back of his neck, as if from a premonition, but he shrugged it off as Rosie continued excitedly. According to Egyptian tradition, the sun god, Ra, ended his daily journey at Abdu, entering the underworld through a peak or a gap in the mountains. Then he traveled through the underworld on a solar barge, battling evil spirits during the 12 hours of night as they tried to prevent him from completing his journey and waking the world to daylight once more. She peered at the inscription again. "It all makes sense now. It seems that we will need to travel through a recreation of the underworld to gain access to the Tomb of Destiny." Charlie leaned back against the side of the excavation, carefully so as not to disturb anything. "When you say a recreation of the underworld," he remarked, trying to appear nonchalant, "just what do you mean?" "I don't exactly know until we get there," Rosie said carefully, "but I'm guessing that it will be some kind of underground tunnel system. You said that the notebook mentions a portal under the water, so maybe the chambers are filled with water. The inscription says that we will need the Amduat to get through the passages. The Amduat is an ancient text describing the journey of the sun god through the underworld. That's amazing, because the Amduat was supposed to have been written much later in Egyptian history. This inscription proves that the Amduat is at least as old as Zoser." Still maintaining the semblance of nonchalance, although completely confused, Charlie asked, "So you're saying that we will need to sail through these chambers on a boat, and evil spirits will try and stop us along the way?" Rosie opened her mouth to reply, then hesitated for a moment, unsure whether the danger they might face was worth the potential reward, but then visions of golden treasure flitted through her mind's eye, and she nodded. "Yes, Charlie," she stated firmly, "we must travel to Abydos and find the entrance to the underworld that will lead us through a series of chambers to the Tomb of Destiny. The sacred symbols will show us where to gain access." She grabbed his sleeve and gazed up at him pleadingly. "I know we can do it, Charlie." He couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm, and he started to take her hands to reassure her when they heard a noise above the pit. Looking up, they saw the foreman and their guide, both of whom were jabbering excitedly. After a moment, the guide's voice prevailed. "Mr. Waterman, we must leave quickly. Leave now. There are people coming and they have guns." Noises of frenetic activity started to filter down towards them, shouts and indiscriminate sounds of blows. Then another shout, sounding disturbingly like Max, which cut off abruptly in mid-yodel. As they turned to climb up out of the pit, however, several strange figures had appeared at the edge, reaching down and hauling the couple up with a minimum of courtesy. Charlie arrived at the top breathlessly and wrenched himself free of his rescuers, only to see a troop of Arabs, robed and booted, brandishing rifles and curved daggers. Their leader, however, while similarly robed, was considerably fairer-skinned, and Charlie's instinctive move forward stopped as he stared in shock at the face of a man that he knew only too well. Donovan Brady grunted and motioned to the two henchmen who had pulled Charlie out of the pit, and they seized his arms once more. "I'm afraid," he said shortly. "You won't be going back to Cairo just yet." Stunned, Charlie looked around for the rest of the group. Chatsworth stood only a few feet away, his face white, similarly restrained by thugs, and the workers huddled in a group threatened by a few more armed Arabs. And Max? Where was Max? He thought he had heard the bodyguard shouting during the melee, but another quick survey was equally fruitless. Brady looked up from his contemplation of the pit, noticing Charlie's growing agitation. "Oh, if you're looking for your large friend, he's over there," he remarked, gesturing to where Max was knelt in the sand, his hands tied behind his back and a gun pointing at his head. Charlie's eyes blazed and he started forward before he was yanked back again. "If you—" he jerked out angrily, only to be interrupted by the professor's bored tone. "Bit of a hothead, that one." He added a comment in Arabic, which resulted in ugly laughter from his followers, one of whom explained in broken but unfortunately comprehensible English that the soldier had fought so well it had required the butt end of a rifle to bring him down. Brady's cool gaze met Charlie's hot eyes, and he added, "If you don't want to join him, I'd recommend that you watch yourself, young man. You've caused me enough trouble as it is." He issued quick orders to his men and quickly lowered himself over the edge of the pit so he could examine the stela for himself. Brady found the hieroglyphic inscription at once, reading aloud as he translated, "Abydos, I should have known." Heaving himself out of the pit, he turned to Charlie, his face grim. "All right, my boy. My thanks for leading me to the marker and doing all the hard work. What I require from you now is the notebook with the sacred symbols, and quickly." Charlie smiled. "Bugger off," he said rebelliously, the bad language said to prevent his growing fear from showing. Brady growled menacingly, hands curling into fists. "I said no," Charlie added. "I don't have it with me anyway." "And we'll never tell you where it is," shouted a furious Rosie. She had had enough of the dirty hands holding her arms and tried to wriggle free of them, only to be grabbed none too gently by her captors. Her small shriek of dismay galvanized Charlie, who made a Herculean effort and ripped free of his own guards. He flung himself upon Rosie's tormentors, grabbing one and pulling him away, sending the man flying from a swift but strong jab to the nose, and reached for the other, his normally pleasant face ugly with anger. A quick word and gesture from Brady, however, and Charlie was immediately overwhelmed by several bodies, who pummeled him with fists and feet. He was finally hauled more or less upright, to stand swaying between and supported by two of the henchmen as Brady gave him a disgusted look. "Do I detect an affection for this young lady, Mr. Waterman?" Charlie said nothing, simply glaring at the professor. Brady coughed and motioned to his men. "Fill in this hole," he shouted. "Fill it in and cover it completely. No one must know of this." One of the Arabs spoke quickly. Although Charlie couldn't understand the words, the tone was ominous. Brady nodded and turned away. "Tie their hands so we can avoid these silly melodramatics," he ordered. "Then bring them over to the pyramid. Perhaps a bit of persuasion is needed." For Rosie's sake, he managed a brave grin as their arms were pulled roughly behind them, leather straps wrapped around their wrists, and they were marched off toward the step pyramid to await Brady's next move. Charlie managed to lean close enough to whisper a quick, Don't worry, Rosie. We'll get through this. Now, if he could only believe it himself. Despite the tension and the precariousness of their situation, Charlie looked around with interest as they were dragged close up to the great step pyramid of Zoser. Its outline stood out against the evening sky. The pyramid itself was sealed up with a large iron grate, but Brady took them to some workmen's huts close by. As Charlie looked around, he saw Max. There was a large gash on the side of his forehead, and it had bled freely, mixing with dirt and sand to look ugly indeed, but his eyes were alert and bright with anger. He would clearly be ready to make the most of any opportunity for escape that might present itself. Charlie's rucksack contained the Webley, and the Arabs had unwittingly brought it from the dig site, along with their other possessions. The items were dumped in the corner of the hut, and no one had thought to search through them. As Charlie thought furiously, trying to cobble together a plan, he was distracted by Brady, who approached him and was now pacing back and forth as he spoke. The hate in Brady's eyes was palpable. "I know you think I'm just some fusty old professor, but I grew up on the streets of Dublin. I can handle myself in a brawl probably far better than you." He stopped pacing and leaned in towards Charlie. "I will do anything at all, to obtain this treasure." Charlie shook his head uncomprehendingly. Here was a highly respected academic, whose reputation was well known and spotless, descending to what amounted to common thuggery and piracy. He started to say so as diplomatically as he could, but Brady overrode him. "I've spent my whole life building an academic reputation. For what? A researcher? A teacher? Those are hardly professions which attract any kind of true celebrity. This treasure, on the other hand, this is my chance. My chance to become famous, finally. I'll be the most famous archaeologist in the world. And the added bonus is that I'll be rich as well." His face was becoming dangerously flushed, and Charlie wondered irrationally how stable the man's heart was. "I need this treasure, and no one, not you, not anyone will prevent me from achieving my goals. Do you understand?" Shockingly, his hand shot out and smacked Charlie across the face unexpectedly. "Where is the notebook, Waterman?" he yelled. Face stinging from the blow, Charlie shook his head and stared down his nose at Brady with every bit of elitism that he could muster. He was, after all, a waterman, his heritage traceable back to at least the 1500s. Brady was really just a street tough who had managed to make good despite his humble beginnings. Another massive slap, and Charlie's ears rang, but he stared at his tormentor and actually mustered a laugh. "You're wasting your time, Brady." The professor's eyes narrowed. "I need the sacred symbols that you have hidden from me. Think you're tough, do you, boy? Are you tough enough? That's the question." He motioned at one of his men. "Convince him," he said shortly, and stepped back away from the young Englishman. The henchman moved closer until Charlie could see the flail dangling from his hand, and delivered a grin full of yellowed and missing teeth, which unfortunately reminded Charlie of his camel. Something of that amusement must have flickered in his face, because the grin dimmed as the Arab's face darkened with anger. He lifted his arm, barely moving his wrist, and Charlie gasped for breath as the wooden beads smashed suddenly and viciously into his ribs. Concentrating on breathing through his nose, he wondered how something that seemed so delicate could have such an impact, then stopped trying to figure it out as the flail thudded into his abdomen this time, doubling him over. Coughing and choking, he sagged against the arms of his captors as Rosie screamed and Brady watched coldly. Finally, they hauled him upright again to face the irritated professor. "Had enough, Waterman?" Brady inquired. Charlie wet dry lips with his tongue, hoping his voice wouldn't betray him. "Not at all. This is nothing compared to some of the beatings you get at public school. Of course, you wouldn't know anything about that being a street thug." He was quite proud of himself, delivered both condescension and heavy sarcasm in one breath without gasping out loud, he thought, then coughed again, violently, as the flail came around once more, striking the same place with uncanny accuracy. He wanted nothing more than to curl up on the floor in a ball and hug the abused area to himself, protect it from further harm, but he forced himself to stand up and stare right back at the now infuriated academic. It was times like this that his stubbornness became a positive character trait. He was damned if he was going to give in, and said so heatedly, in no uncertain terms. "Stick it up your arse!" he shouted. He was surprised by his own bad language, but it helped. Brady eyed his disheveled captive with distaste. Much as he hated to admit it, Charlie was clearly not going to cooperate, and beating him half to death, while it might prove temporarily satisfying, would ultimately be counterproductive. Another target was going to have to be the answer. He beckoned to one of his company of thugs and held a brief whispered conference, then jerked his head towards Chatsworth. That one. Chatsworth? Charlie thought in dismay. What kind of sick mind would torture an old man? He started forward to object, but was jerked back by his guards, one of whom shook his head and drew a finger across his throat, his meaning clear. Charlie subsided, watching reluctantly as Chatsworth was made to sit on a stone, his arms still pinioned behind him. One of the Arabs removed the old man's boots, then stood holding his legs out in front of him, the soles of his feet facing forward. The man holding the flail moved to stand in front of them, measuring the distance. Then the flail snapped out and connected fully with the sole of Chatsworth's right foot, eliciting a startled squawk of pain. Brady smiled at the reaction and nodded for the beating to continue. At first, Rosie's father made a brave effort to withstand the pain from the flail, although he was unable to keep from crying out as it connected with the tender soles of his feet. But after a short time, his labored breathing showed clearly that his resolve was weakening. Rosie had tried to go to him, but had been prevented by her guards. She had been forced to settle for calling out to him in encouragement, which now seemed to be less and less effective. A few more vicious blows, and Chatsworth could no longer bear it. Tears leaking from his eyes, he mumbled, "The safe, it's in the room safe. Oh, Charlie, I'm sorry, I can't." Brady cut the incoherent monologue short. "The safe, old man. What room?" He considered while Chatsworth blubbered on. "Ah, it must be Mr. Waterman's room. Where else would it possibly be?" He reached down and pulled Chatsworth's bent head up to face him. "Waterman's room? Yes, I can see by your face that I'm right." Another moment's thought, and Brady forced the other man to look at him once more. "Just one more thing, old man," he purred. "This safe, would it be having a key now?" Chatsworth made one last grab at the shreds of his dignity and shook his head mutely, although he couldn't conceal his trembling. Brady simply laughed. "Perhaps your feet are not sufficiently warmed, sir?" he signaled, and the flail landed with a hard slap that echoed in the chamber once, twice more, and Chatsworth cracked. "Yes, it does. There's a key," he babbled, begging them to stop. Brady sighed. "It's like excavating an artifact, I'm telling you. Everything piecemeal. All right, old man. We've established that there's a key. Would you be telling me where I might find that key?" The embattled old man, already distraught at his own weakness, had said as much as he was going to say. He firmly closed his mouth, determined to withstand any further onslaught on his body with whatever little dignity he could muster. But the damage had been done. The automatic flicker of his eyes in his daughter's direction had not been missed by the sharp gaze of the professor, who now strolled in her direction. "If I understand your father correctly, my dear," he said to Rosie, "it appears you are in possession of the key that I need." He stopped in front of her and gave her an offensively long stare from head to foot and back. He grabbed her firmly by the neck and pulled her head towards him. Rosie struggled intensely, but his strong grasp kept her in check. Not the same flower you had with you when you visited me at Oxford, Waterman. And where is that delectable bit of English womanhood, hey? Does she know about this one here?" He let her go, and she immediately spat in his face. Charlie's fists balled up, and his face darkened. "If you want to leave her alone and ask me that question again, I'll be happy to enlighten you." Brady laughed. "Perhaps later, once I have what I want." He jerked his head at Rosie's guards. "Get the key. Do whatever you need to do." The man to Rosie's right leered at her as he wiggled his fingers suggestively. "Perhaps I should undress you to find this key," he declared as she cringed away from his reaching hands. Although the man had spoken in Arabic, his intent was clear in any language. The image of Rosie laughingly stowing the key away was achingly vivid in Charlie's mind's eye, and the thought of that animal searching for it. "Leave her alone!" he shouted, once more trying to wrench free of his captors and earning himself a hard cuff on the head for his pains. The man on Rosie's left wrenched her arms behind her back even harder to give his partner freer rein, and the other man grinned again, licking greasy lips, his eyes promising things Rosie didn't want to see or even think about. Rosie closed her eyes as the smelly Arab drew ever closer. He grabbed her tightly around her throat and pushed her backwards against the wall as the other man's hand started to unbutton her dress. Charlie shouted out again in anger, but this time a swift kick to the groin shut him up quickly as one of the guards let fly with his right boot. Rosie screamed out aloud, but the Arab quickly cupped his grubby hands over her mouth, and she started to cry as the Arab slipped his hand inside her tunic, his fingers groping around, probing and examining. Chatsworth couldn't bear to look and turned away sobbing, blaming himself for revealing the location of the key. Brady, however, who was watching the proceedings with great interest, smiled a horrible smirky grin that showed him up for what he really was, a sad and deprived old man. Rosie looked straight into the eyes of her mauling attacker and tried to imagine what horrors might be coming next. Her mind raced uncontrollably, and she gave a final sob of desperation as she passed out, and all was darkness. As she came round from her tormented sleep, Rosie felt the heavy weight of a hand on her shoulder, and she jerked away reflexively. She almost fell as the hold unexpectedly relaxed, and then disappeared altogether. She could hear bodies scuffling, and voices were shouting, a babble of Arabic, English, and, bizarrely, bits of what sounded like French. She felt hands again at her wrists, and sobbed with fear and loathing, then with relief at the familiar voice she heard in her ear. "Shh, sweetheart. It's all right. It's over," Charlie soothed, finally succeeding in loosening the straps to remove them altogether and freeing Rosie's hands. Eyes still closed, she turned and flung her arms around his neck as she continued to sob from fright. He stood patiently, stroking her neck and shoulders. Finally, she hiccuped a few times, took a few long choking breaths, and quieted enough to open her eyes and regain some degree of calm. The scene before her was markedly different. Uniformed strangers, evidently policemen, were subduing Brady's men, some of whom had already been laid low by the infuriated Max, as they had attempted to resist capture. Her father's feet were being attended to by yet another stranger, while he talked shakily with a dapper gentleman sporting an exquisitely tended goatee and speaking rapidly in excellent English tinged with a substantial French accent. "We've been rescued, darling," Charlie remarked, as the policeman continued to secure Brady's group of thugs. "You must have passed out. Then the lights went out, and that gent talking with your father came bursting in with the local gendarmes. Things became a trifle exciting for a few minutes, I must admit." He glanced over at Chatsworth and the well-dressed stranger. "I suppose that fellow's the local police inspector or some such thing." Rosie shook her head. She buttoned up her dress as she spoke. She had immediately recognized the stranger standing before them. "No, Charlie, he's even more powerful than that." She nodded emphatically as he stared at her curiously. "That gent is none other than the director of archaeology at the Cairo Museum, Gaston Maspero." "We received an anonymous tip," Maspero said, as the police physician moved about the chamber tending to their injuries. "Brady has been exporting illegal artifacts for years. We were fortunate enough to be advised of the professor's whereabouts." He removed a large handkerchief from a pocket and spread it on one of the upright stones, then sat down carefully as the group drew closer to listen. Rosie had quickly brought Charlie up to date on their new acquaintance. Gaston Maspero had studied under the eminent French archaeologist and Egyptologist Auguste Mariette, eventually succeeding him as Director General of Excavations in Egypt, heading the largest of the foreign scientific teams in the country, including the museum directorship. Over the intervening years, he had also earned a reputation for sniffing out illegal activities involving ancient artifacts and swiftly bringing the perpetrators to justice. Obviously, Brady's activities had attracted his attention, and the Frenchman had commenced an investigation. Brady was attempting to bluff his way out of his predicament. "This isn't what you think, Maspero. I'm conducting a perfectly legitimate exploration here. You gave Chatsworth the permit yourself." "That I scarcely believe, Professor. Monsieur Chatsworth and I enjoyed a very pleasant conversation at the time that he applied for the permit, and he made no mention of your involvement in his venture, which I believe he would have done, if only to notify me that someone of your scholarly stature would be a member of his party. Besides," he added, as Brady made a sudden but fruitless attempt to twist away from the two officers standing guard over him, "I have been investigating you and your illegal activities for some time now." Maspero's face started to flush with passion. "I have made it my career to prevent the despoilment and illegal removal of ancient artifacts by scum who seek to become rich from such endeavors and those who greedily purchase them, but their baseness is surpassed by men such as you who betray your commitment to seeking knowledge by encouraging these unforgivable thefts." A well-manicured finger pointed at the fuming professor. "I have evidence that you have assisted in the smuggling of artifacts from this country for years, Professor. And now, in your arrogance, you have finally made your mistake. On Egyptian soil, you come under my jurisdiction, and you will be extradited to England only if you are extremely fortunate." A wave of Maspero's fingers, and one of the policemen snapped to attention. "Take these criminals away and secure them for trial," the Frenchman ordered. "Immediately. This pyramid has been sullied by their presence for too long already." Brady glared at the hands which had tightened on his arms as his escort began to walk him out of the chamber. "You don't know what you're doing, Maspero. They have found the sanctuary at Abydos." Infuriated shouts continued to float back to the inner chamber as the police procession moved off. Continuing screams of Brady's purported indispensability mercifully becoming fainter and finally disappearing as he was removed from earshot. Maspero glanced over to where Charlie and Rosie were standing and beckoned the young man over, giving him an appraising stare. He said quietly, wondering what depths might be hidden behind this young Englishman's genial good looks. "If I may inquire, what is it that you are up to, Mr. Waterman? Is it true, what Professor Brady claims, that you have found the entrance to a secret sanctuary at Abydos?" He knew Maspero could end his quest with one word if he so chose, but Charlie was still reluctant to speak, unsure how to present his case without endangering the expedition. Something of his unease must have transmitted itself to Maspero, who sighed. "You know, young man, I don't quite know what I should do with you. Technically, you have done nothing wrong, but if I were to determine any illegality to your endeavor, I have the power to throw all of you in prison." He nodded towards the exit. "You saw what I did with Monsieur Brady?" Maspero rose and began to pace, motioning Charlie to accompany him. After a minute or two of strolling around the hut, he said suddenly, "I knew your grandfather, you know." At Charlie's surprised look, he nodded and continued. "Yes, I met him on one occasion, at a conference in London. I enjoyed our encounter very much. He was a very amusing man. He told me that he would often bite the ankles of his dinner guests." He laughed, a full, rich sound, while Charlie smiled politely and waited patiently. He made another 2 circuits of the room before Maspero halted, and reseated himself after once more smoothing out the handkerchief. "Look here, young man. Your grandparry was a good and honest man. He was a naturalist and a man of great honor, not a treasure hunter at all." The sharp eyes bored directly into Charlie's, as if to see into his very soul. "I trust that you are of the same blood, Charlie took a long breath and released it. "I would hope to be, sir. There is no one I respect more in the world than my grandfather." Maspero grunted with satisfaction. "And there we have it then. Blood will out, young man. I have made my decision. I will let you go on to Abydos. If you have discovered a secret sanctuary out there in the desert, then you can help me to secure it for the Antiquities Department." A broad smile spread across his face as he saw the release of tension in Charlie's face. "My people are very busy with archaeological digs all over Egypt. You can help me if you wish, and in turn I will help you." He pulled a pad and pencil from a pocket and began to write. "Flinders Petrie, a good friend and eminent scholar, is excavating at Abydos. If you give him my note, I will authorize your searches." Charlie realized that he was still holding his breath and let it go with relief. "Thank you very much, sir. I won't disappoint you." Maspero nodded. "See that you don't, Monsieur Waterman. Remember also that anything of value you find must be turned over to the authorities for proper assessment. I am trusting you in this endeavor, not just for your grandfather's reputation, but for your own sake." "You have my word," said Charlie. "On my grandfather's life." They began to make their way outside and away from the pyramid. At first, Rosie had held Charlie's arm closely to her as they trooped along, but then Chatsworth's awkward stumbling on his sore feet caught her attention. She pressed a quick kiss, so fast he almost didn't feel it, on Charlie's cheek, and then abandoned him to help support her wavering father as he winced along. Max moved up alongside Charlie as if to fill the vacant spot and muttered, "I'm sorry we weren't able to subdue them all before they overpowered us," Max said quietly, somehow managing to sound matter-of-fact and ashamed at the same time. Charlie shook his head. "There was an awful lot of them, Max. Don't blame yourself." And fine advice to give, he thought bitterly to himself, as he watched Chatsworth making his painful way along. His own pig-headedness had resulted in the old man's being subjected to brutal treatment. "I should have found a way to keep Brady focused on me." Max stopped dead and stared at him, hard. "Begging your pardon, sir, but that's just outright stupid. You didn't know help was on the way. Besides, blokes like Brady, they're sadists. I saw that look often enough in the army. He would have got round to the others eventually, believe me." Charlie nodded, resigning himself to the fact that the world outside his own sheltered life contained a fair number of truths, both good and bad, and wondering briefly how much more his life might be affected by the events of his quest. His reverie continued until they had reached the bus park. Glancing around at his companions, he spoke. "My friends, now that we have disposed of the villains, let's be off to Abydos and find the Tomb of Destiny." A gentle breeze wafted in from the direction of the River Nile, barely rippling the loose sand in the pyramid courtyard. In the inky darkness of the night, a shadowy figure stood hidden by the pyramid entrance. The stranger stepped out of the shadows once Charlie and his group had passed him by. He stood for a moment watching them all carefully. Then he made his way down to the other side of the complex, to a waiting horse. Climbing up into the saddle, he took the reins firmly and galloped off towards Cairo. With Brady out of the way, no one could spoil his plans. Soon, he would meet up with the young Waterman again, and this time Edward Sampson would have his revenge.